Just after 2 in the morning on November 21st, 1970, Captain Dick Meadows stood inside a North Vietnamese prison compound 23 miles from Hanoi. He had just executed one of the most precisely planned raids of the entire war, and he raised a bullhorn to announce a rescue to prisoners who were no longer there to hear it. Meadows and his men had trained for this exact moment for 4 months, rehearsing the assault more than 170 times against a full-scale mock-up of this exact compound, built in secret specifically so that every man on the mission would know the layout of this prison better than the guards who actually worked there. Moments earlier, the helicopter carrying Meadows and his assault team had deliberately crash-landed inside the compound's walls, a maneuver so precise and so unconventional that it had taken real courage from the pilot to attempt it exactly as planned. The team had moved with speed and violence, eliminating the guard force in the prison's central compound within minutes, exactly as 4 months of rehearsal had prepared them to do. Meadows raised his bullhorn into the darkness and called out the words the entire operation had been built around. "We are Americans. This is a rescue. Keep your heads down. We're getting you out." He waited for the sound of American voices answering him, the sound that would mean months of planning and training had finally paid off in the way every man on this mission had trained so hard to achieve. The silence that answered him instead told him, within seconds, something that would take the rest of the raid and years of careful investigation afterward to fully understand. The compound was empty. There were no prisoners inside it to rescue at all. Meadows could not know, standing in that empty compound with his bullhorn still raised, that the men he had come to rescue were, at that very moment, only a few miles away, close enough that some of them would later describe hearing the sounds of his raid unfolding in the distance. He knew only that a mission executed with near-perfect precision had, through no failure of skill or courage on the part of anyone who carried it out, found nothing where its entire purpose was supposed to be waiting. That is the story of the raid that succeeded completely at everything except the one thing it was actually sent to accomplish. Now let me show you exactly how that happened and why it mattered anyway. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it, on both sides, deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand how a mission this carefully planned could still arrive to find its objective gone, you first have to understand exactly how much care and precision actually went into planning it in the first place. To understand what makes this story remarkable, you have to understand exactly how much preparation went into this specific mission, because few operations of the entire war were planned with this level of obsessive, exhaustive care. Intelligence officers first identified the compound at Son Tay in the spring of 1970 when a reconnaissance aircraft flying at extreme altitude photographed the site and revealed strong evidence of American prisoners held inside. The camp sat only 23 miles from Hanoi itself, and roughly 12,000 North Vietnamese troops were stationed within 5 miles of it, a proximity that made any rescue attempt an extraordinarily dangerous proposition, requiring a raiding force to strike deep inside heavily defended territory, complete its mission quickly, and withdraw before North Vietnamese reinforcements could respond in strength. Colonel Arthur Simons, a Special Forces officer whose reputation had been built over decades, including a celebrated prisoner rescue during the Second World War, was selected to lead the ground assault force, and he approached the assignment with a level of rigor that became legendary among the men who trained under him. 56 volunteers, hand-selected from a much larger pool of candidates, spent 4 months training specifically for this mission, rehearsing the assault against a precise, full-scale mock-up of the compound built specifically for this purpose, run through more than 170 times until every man involved understood his exact role, his exact position, and his exact sequence of actions well enough to execute them in complete darkness under fire without hesitation. This level of preparation extended to every detail of the operation. The raiding force organized into 3 distinct elements, each with a specific and carefully rehearsed function. One element, designated Blue Boy and led by Captain Dick Meadows, would land directly inside the compound itself, using a helicopter crash landing specifically chosen because it eliminated the need to breach the compound's outer defenses before beginning the actual rescue. A second element, Greenleaf, would land just outside the walls and blow an entry point to reinforce Meadows and his men. A third element, Red Wine, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Elliot Sidner, would establish a defensive perimeter capable of holding off North Vietnamese reaction forces long enough for the rescue to be completed and the entire raiding party extracted safely. On the night of November 20th into the early morning of November 21st, this exhaustively rehearsed plan was executed with a level of precision that matched and in some respects exceeded everything the months of preparation had promised, and understanding exactly how well the raid actually went makes the eventual disappointment considerably more striking. The helicopter carrying Meadows and his Blue Boy element crash-landed inside the compound almost exactly as rehearsed, and his team moved immediately to secure the central prison area, eliminating the guard force stationed there within minutes of touching down. The Greenleaf and Red Wing elements executed their own portions of the plan with similar precision, breaching the compound's outer wall and establishing the defensive perimeter needed to protect the operation from the substantial North Vietnamese forces known to be stationed nearby. Across the entire raiding force, documented accounts describe more than 50 enemy personnel killed during the assault, a testament to how completely and how quickly the raiders had overwhelmed the compound's defenses. The cost to the raiding force itself was remarkably, almost improbably light, given the scale and danger of the operation. Only 2 American casualties were recorded across the entire mission. 1 Green Beret struck by enemy fire in the leg, and 1 helicopter crew member who suffered a broken ankle during the deliberate crash landing. An injury caused not by enemy action, but by equipment inside the aircraft shifting during the impact. For a raid conducted this deep inside heavily defended enemy territory against a compound surrounded by thousands of enemy troops, this casualty count represented an extraordinary achievement, a testament to the months of preparation that had gone into every aspect of the operation's execution. The extraction itself proceeded with the same careful precision. The raiding force withdrawing by helicopter before North Vietnamese reinforcements could organize an effective response, though the broader air support accompanying the mission did encounter serious danger during the withdrawal, with anti-aircraft missiles striking 2 supporting aircraft. Both crews survived, recovered by rescue aircraft after several tense hours on the ground, closing out an operation that had, by nearly every tactical measure available, gone about as well as an operation this dangerous and this complex could possibly have gone. Now understand exactly why, despite this remarkable tactical execution, the raiding force found no prisoners waiting inside the compound they had trained so extensively to breach, because the answer reveals something important about the specific, unglamorous vulnerability every intelligence-dependent operation ultimately faces. The prisoners who had once been held at Son Tay had, in fact, been moved weeks before the raid actually took place, and the reason had nothing to do with any leaked knowledge of the impending American operation. Flooding from a nearby river had made the original compound impractical to continue using, and North Vietnamese authorities had relocated the prisoners to a different facility, a few miles away as a matter of ordinary logistical necessity, entirely unconnected to the elaborate rescue operation already being planned and rehearsed on the other side of the world. This detail matters enormously to how this story should actually be understood because it removes any suggestion of a security failure or an intelligence leak on the American side. The raid was not compromised by any breach of secrecy, and the meticulous planning that had gone into the operation had not been undone by any failure of operational security. It had simply been overtaken by an entirely mundane, practical circumstance, a flooded river forcing a routine prisoner relocation that happened to occur in the gap between the intelligence photographs that identified the camp and the night the raid was actually finally launched. And there is a genuinely striking detail connected to this relocation that deserves to be told plainly because it adds a layer of near-miss poignancy to an already remarkable story. The prisoners' new location sat close enough to Son Tay that several of them later reported hearing the sounds of the raid itself unfolding in the distance, aware in real time that an American rescue operation was happening somewhere nearby without yet understanding its full scope or its ultimate outcome. Men who had spent years hoping for exactly this kind of rescue effort found themselves on the very night it finally arrived, close enough to hear it happening and still entirely beyond its reach. The raiders themselves, in the immediate aftermath of discovering the compound empty, experienced a disappointment that deserves to be described honestly because months of rehearsal and genuine danger accepted willingly had produced, in the most literal sense, no prisoners actually recovered. Accounts from men who took part in the raid describe genuine, deep frustration in the hours and days immediately following the operation, a sense that an extraordinary effort carried out with real skill and real courage had ultimately failed at the single objective that had justified everything leading up to it. This frustration was entirely understandable, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than smoothed over by the more positive narrative the raid would eventually earn in the years that followed. Men who had trained for months, accepted genuine mortal risk, and executed their roles with near flawless precision, returned from the mission having rescued no one, a difficult and legitimate source of disappointment for anyone who had committed themselves so completely to the effort. But the fuller story of what this raid actually accomplished extended well beyond that immediate, painful disappointment, in ways that became clear only gradually over the months that followed. Word of the raid eventually reached American prisoners held elsewhere in North Vietnam, passed along through the informal communication networks POWs had developed among themselves, and the news that their own government had launched a raid this deep into enemy territory specifically to attempt their rescue produced a genuine and significant boost in morale among men who had, in many cases, spent years wondering whether anyone back home still remembered them at all. The raid produced a second, entirely unplanned consequence as well, one that ultimately benefited the prisoners still held in North Vietnam in a concrete, practical way. In its aftermath, North Vietnamese authorities, alarmed by how deep and how precise this American raid had managed to reach, moved to consolidate scattered prisoners from smaller, more vulnerable camps into larger, more heavily defended facilities, reducing the number of separate locations that needed to be protected against a similar future operation. This consolidation, intended purely as a security measure by North Vietnamese authorities, had the incidental effect of bringing many previously isolated prisoners into closer contact with each other, improving their ability to communicate, organize, and support one another through the remainder of their captivity. It would be incomplete and it would miss something important about how military operations should actually be judged to describe this raid as simply a failure redeemed by unintended consequences, because the honest assessment of Son Tay reveals a more complicated and more instructive truth about the relationship between execution and outcome in any operation this dependent on time-sensitive intelligence. Every element of this raid that fell within the raiders' own control was executed close to flawlessly, and that execution deserves to be judged on its own terms. Separate from the outcome, the raiders had no way to control. The planning, the rehearsal, the actual conduct of the assault, and the extraction under real and serious danger all reflected genuine, exceptional military competence, the kind of preparation and execution that, under slightly different circumstances, would have resulted in exactly the rescue this mission had been built to achieve. The gap between this excellent execution and the disappointing outcome was not a failure of skill, courage, or planning. It was the specific, unavoidable vulnerability every operation built on a snapshot of intelligence carries. The world does not hold still between the moment that intelligence is gathered and the moment an operation built on it is finally executed. This is a genuinely important and honest lesson about the limits of even the most careful military planning, one that deserves to be stated plainly rather than obscured by the raid's eventual positive reputation. No amount of rehearsal, no level of tactical precision can fully protect an operation from a piece of ground truth changing in the gap between reconnaissance and execution, particularly when that gap stretches across months of necessary preparation, as it did in this case. The raiders did everything within their power to succeed. The single variable that actually determined whether prisoners would be found waiting inside that compound was never within their control at all. And it is worth stating honestly that the positive, morale-boosting consequences this raid eventually produced, real and meaningful as they were, do not fully resolve the genuine cost and genuine disappointment the raid also represented. Real risk was accepted by real men on the strength of intelligence that had already gone stale by the time it was finally acted upon, and the honest accounting of this story holds both truths together. A mission executed about as well as any mission of that war ever was, and an outcome that fell short of its stated purpose regardless of how well every element within human control had actually been performed. Meadows and the men who served alongside him carried the specific, complicated memory of that night for the rest of their lives, and in the years afterward, many of them worked through a version of the same difficult reconciliation between their own excellent performance and the outcome that performance had failed to produce. Many raiders, in later interviews and accounts, described a slow and gradual shift in how they came to understand their own service that night, moving from the immediate, sharp disappointment of finding an empty compound toward a more settled understanding of what the mission had actually meant once the fuller picture of its consequences became clear. They had trained with total dedication, executed with genuine skill under real and serious danger, and the eventual knowledge that their effort had reached and encouraged prisoners they never actually met, in camps they never actually visited, offered a form of meaning that took time, in many cases years, to fully settle into place alongside the sharper, more immediate memory of the disappointment itself. Meadows himself continued his military career and remained closely associated with the raid for the rest of his life, one of the mission's most visible and celebrated participants in the years of retrospective attention the operation eventually received. He and the other raiders became known collectively by a name that captured both the extraordinary nature of their preparation and the bittersweet outcome of the mission itself, honored in the years that followed for an operation that had demonstrated about as clearly as any single mission of the entire war could demonstrate the outer limits of what careful planning and genuine courage could actually guarantee. And many of the raiders, in later reflection, came to a settled pride in the mission that did not depend on the outcome that had first disappointed them so deeply. They had done everything asked of them and everything within their own power to do in service of men they had never met, accepting real and serious risk for a rescue that circumstances beyond anyone's control had made impossible before the mission had even begun. That effort, they came to believe, deserved to be remembered honestly on its own terms, regardless of whether the specific outcome they had trained so hard to achieve had actually been there waiting for them when they finally arrived. Here is what the raid on Son Tay actually reveals, and why an empty compound matters as much to this story as any successful rescue might have. 56 men trained for 4 months, rehearsed their assault more than 170 times, and executed a raid deep inside one of the most heavily defended pieces of territory in the entire war with a precision that left almost nothing to chance within their own control. They breached a compound, eliminated its defenders, and prepared to bring American prisoners home. And every single element of that plan that depended on their own skill, courage, and preparation worked exactly as intended. What failed was not the raid. What failed was the assumption, unavoidable in any operation built on intelligence gathered months before its execution, that the world photographed in the spring would still be the world encountered in the fall. That is the real meaning behind the story, and it reaches well past one compound and one disappointing night in November 1970. The most carefully planned operation in the world remains vulnerable to a single, uncontrollable fact. Time passes between intelligence and action, and the world does not agree to hold still simply because a plan requires it to. Meadows and his men did everything a raid like this could ask of any soldier, and they still arrived to find their objective gone. Not because anyone failed, but because a flooded river, entirely indifferent to months of American planning, had already moved the men they came to save. And notice, finally, what this raid actually purchased, even in its apparent failure. Prisoners scattered across North Vietnam, men who never saw a single Green Beret that night, learned in the weeks that followed that their country had reached this close, this deep, in an effort built entirely around bringing them home, and that knowledge mattered to men enduring years of captivity in ways no tactical outcome alone could fully measure. Meadows raised a bullhorn into an empty room and heard only silence answer him, and it would take years for the fuller meaning of that silence to become clear. That is the story of the mission that succeeded at everything except the one thing it was sent to do and mattered anyway. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the missions that succeeded at everything except the outcome everyone was actually praying for on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a Green Beret, a POW, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.